About a year ago, Catholic apologist Joe Heschmeyer dropped what he calls an unanswerable argument against Protestantism. His claim, the Protestant doctrine of Scripture's clarity, also known as perspicuity, demonstrably fails. After 500 years, Protestants can't even agree on which doctrines are essential for salvation, let alone what those doctrines teach. Now, multiple Protestant YouTubers tried to respond to Joe, and then Joe, released a follow-up video insisting nobody had actually successfully addressed his argument, much less countered it. And you know what? I think he's largely right. So today, I'm doing something different. I'm going to actually strengthen Joe's argument to its most powerful form and then show why even that strengthened version fails. Because when we apply rigorous philosophical analysis, specifically the epistemology of disagreement, Joe's unanswerable argument totally collapses. But first, let me show you exactly what Joe's arguing and why most responses have failed. Now, here's Joe's actual argument. He presents a pretty simple syllogism. Premise 1, if Protestant perspicuity is true, sincere believers will agree on essential doctrine. Premise 2, sincere believers don't agree on essential doctrines. Conclusion, Protestant perspicuity is false. Now, before you rush to object, Joe actually says what he's not arguing, which I think is helpful. He's not arguing that any disagreement falsifies a belief system, that any Protestant disunity is a proof of Catholicism, that Catholics are more unified than Protestants, or that unity alone validates truth. Instead, his target is more focused. Protestantism makes specific, empirically testable claims. Scripture is so clear on essentials that ordinary believers using them by ordinary means will understand them. This claim, Joe argues, is falsified by what we observe. And then his knockout example is the Trinity. Protestants using Scripture alone reach three mutually exclusive conclusions. Number one, the Trinity is true and essential for salvation. Two, the Trinity is true but not essential for salvation. Or three, the Trinity is false and believing it imperils salvation. Same method, same Scripture, completely incompatible results about God's very nature. Now, most Protestant responses have dodged this by attacking weaker versions of his arguments. So let me do what they haven't. Let me make his argument even stronger. So here's the steel man of his argument that no one expected. His current version has exploitable weaknesses. Who counts as sincere? What counts as ordinary means? So to get rid of these weaknesses, here's the strongest version. First premise, if Scripture possesses the perspicuity claimed by Protestant confessions, then believers employing ordinary interpretive means will reach agreement on doctrines that those same confessions identify as essential for salvation. Premise 2, that's not the case. Believers employing ordinary interpretive means do not reach such agreement. Conclusion, Scripture does not possess the claimed perspicuity. Now, this is formally valid. It has the same structure as Joe's argument. It's a modus tollens. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. It uses Protestantism's own definitions. So the burden's now on Protestants to either deny the major premise, which is abandoning perspicuity, deny the minor premise, so demonstrate that agreement exists, or accept the conclusion, admit that perspicuity fails. Now, you might wonder, though, why focus on perspicuity rather than sola scriptura itself? There's three reasons. First, perspicuity is empirically testable. We can observe whether believers actually understood essentials. Second, it's logically prior or practically prior. If Scripture isn't clear, then Scripture alone becomes an authority you can't reliably understand. Third, it avoids abstract debates about tradition and focuses on these observable outcomes. So we can think of perspicuity like a load-bearing wall. If you remove it, sola scriptura, even if it's true, collapses into practical uselessness. So how do I plan to defeat even this strengthened argument? By exposing a fundamental philosophical error Joe doesn't even realize he's making. It's probably not what you think. It's philosophical. He misunderstands what philosophers call epistemic peerhood, like your peer. Now, let me explain that with an example that will make this clear. Imagine you have two equally skilled mathematicians examining a proof. Before they even start, they're what philosophers call likelihood peers. They're equally likely to get the right answer. But now imagine that one concludes the proof is valid while the other says it's invalid. Are they still peers? According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on disagreement, which I'm mainly going to refer to and use as my source, we need to distinguish between two types of peerhood. There's likelihood peers. So those are people equally likely to judge correctly before even looking at the evidence. So we can imagine likelihood peers like two seminary graduates with similar training. They might be likelihood peers about the Trinity. And then we have conditional peers, people equally likely to be correct given that they disagree. So this is why this matters for Joe's argument and where his reasoning falls apart. Think about this carefully. If Scripture is genuinely clear on the Trinity and two people reach opposing conclusions, Protestant theology says they can't be conditional peers. Why? Well, one of them has necessarily failed to properly read the clear text. The disagreement itself reveals an epistemic asymmetry. Now, Joe wants it both ways. He wants disagreeing believers to count as equally reliable as peers, while simultaneously having reached contradictory conclusions about supposedly clear texts. But that's logically incoherent given what perspicuity claims. Now, let me drive this home with an analogy that exposes the flaw in Joe's thinking. So we can think of this as the instruction manual problem. Suppose I hand two equally intelligent people clearly written instruction manual, not like most instruction manuals, but this one's clearly written for assembling a bookshelf. One builds it correctly, the other builds something totally different, maybe even something dangerous. Does the second person's failure prove the manual was unclear, or does it prove they misread it? And once they've demonstrated they can't follow clear instructions, are they still an equally reliable judge of what the manual says? The answer is kind of obvious, and it destroys Joe's argument. When someone denies the Trinity while reading biblical texts that clearly teach it, perspicuity says the failure is in the reader, not in the text's clarity. This isn't circular reasoning. It's a direct implication of what clarity means. But wait, Joe has a response to this. He invokes something that philosophers call the independence principle. And this is where things get really interesting. His response actually makes things worse for Catholicism. And this is the independence trap that Joe actually sets for himself, perhaps unwittingly. So the independence principle, as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Article states, you can't use the disputed belief itself to dismiss someone's opinion. You can't just say, I believe P, they believe not P, therefore they're wrong. Now, Joe thinks this principle condemns Protestants who dismiss anti-Trinitarian interpretations. After all, aren't they just saying, hey, look, they disagree with me about the Trinity, so they got to be reading Scripture wrong? But Joe misunderstands the logical structure here. Perspicuity is an ontological claim about the text's properties, not an epistemological guarantee about every reader. So when someone denies clear teaching, the failure is in their interpretation, not in clarity. Moreover, and here's where it gets really interesting, Joe's strict independence requirement backfires on Catholicism. When a Protestant rejects magisterial authority, Catholics can't come back and say, well, they reject the magisterium, therefore they're interpreting tradition wrong. That would violate that independence principle that Joe mentions as much as the Protestant move that Joe condemns. So Joe wants this asymmetric application. Protestants can't use interpretive conclusions to assess reliability, but Catholics can accept the magisterium as a criterion. That's philosophical special pleading. But the problems for Joe's argument run even deeper when we examine what we can actually know about these supposed peer disagreements. Here's the unknown cases and why Joe can't establish peerhood. Here's a problem for Joe's argument that philosophers of disagreement have identified. In most real-world disagreements, we simply can't determine whether the disputants are genuine peers. So take, for instance, two systematic theologians of the Protestant persuasion, Wayne Grudem and Millard Erickson. They disagree about eternal functional subordination, and we know their academic credentials, but do we know how many hours each spent studying these specific texts? What unconscious biases shaped their reading? Whether one was distracted or stressed during key reading periods? What prior theological commitments influenced their interpretation? Or whether one has relevant historical or linguistic knowledge that the other lacks. The SEP article on disagreement actually identifies 8 factors that determine epistemic positioning: cognitive ability, evidence, background knowledge, time devoted, distractions, biases, attentiveness, and intellectual virtues. Without knowing how these disputants compare on all these factors, we can't establish genuine peerhood. Joe's argument requires not just that the disagreeing parties appear similar, but they're actually epistemic equals on all relevant dimensions. But this is almost never demonstrable, and it's certainly not the case in these theological cases that Joe cites. But even if we could establish peerhood, Joe faces another brutal problem. He confuses completely different types of disagreement. So we have deep versus surface disagreement, and he's going to conflate these two things. The philosophical literature distinguishes between these two types of disagreement, and Joe's argument depends on conflating them. Deep disagreements involve fundamental differences about what counts as evidence. The parties lack any dispute-independent common ground. Now, when someone rejects Scripture's authority totally, that's a deep disagreement. Surface disagreements occur within a shared framework. Protestant debates about the Trinity's metaphysics are surface disagreements in that sense. Everyone accepts Scripture's authority and Trinitarian monotheism. They're debating philosophical elaborations, and that distinction really is crucial. So when Reformed and Lutheran theologians debate whether the Son's submission to the Father is eternal or economical, they're having a surface disagreement within shared Trinitarian commitment. When someone denies the Trinity altogether, they've rejected the shared interpretive framework itself. Joe treats these as equally problematic for perspicuity. But surface disagreements within a framework don't undermine that framework's clarity any more than scientific disagreements undermine the scientific method. Speaking of frameworks, let's look at how Joe's own framework self-destructs. Now, this is the self-defeat that Joe can't escape. The philosophical literature on disagreement identifies a fatal problem for views like Joe's, and it's called self-defeat. If disagreement among qualified interpreters undermines clarity's claims, then Catholic theologians massively disagree about magisterial teaching. Therefore, magisterial teaching lacks clarity. Therefore, the Catholic solution fails. Now, this isn't hypothetical. Catholics really disagree about which papal statements are infallible, what Vatican II actually taught, whether certain practices are morally permissible, how to interpret Amoris Laetitia 5. Cardinals formally requested clarification on basic doctrinal questions, and then they received no clear answer. So, if Protestant disagreements disprove perspicuity, then Catholic disagreement equally disproves magisterial clarity. Joe can't escape this logic without special pleading. His argument, if sound, destroys not just Protestant, but all religious epistemologies, including his own. But the deepest problem with Joe's argument involves misunderstanding what kind of evidence disagreement actually provides. First order evidence is direct evidence about a claim, like what the biblical texts say about God's nature. Higher order evidence is evidence about your evidence, the fact that people disagree. Joe treats disagreement as devastating higher order evidence against perspicuity. But defenders of the right reasons view argue that correctly evaluated first order evidence isn't defeated by misleading higher order evidence. So, think about it. If biblical texts clearly teach that God is three persons in one essence, which it does, the fact that some people misread this doesn't make the text unclear. It reveals reading failure. The SCP notes that this position is philosophically respectable, even if it's controversial. So Joe can't simply assume higher order evidence automatically defeats first order clarity. That's actually what's under dispute in the philosophical literature. So here's what Joe's argument actually needs if it's going to succeed and establish. He would need to show that there's genuine conditional peerhood, that all disagreeing parties are equally likely to be correct given their disagreement, not just similar credentials. He would need a working independence principle that can be formulated without problems and applied symmetrically to all positions. He needs higher order defeat, that disagreement automatically undermines that first order textual clarity. And he needs non-self defeat, that his principle doesn't equally destroy Catholic epistemology. The philosophical literature shows all four are highly contested and demonstrably false. Joe hasn't established any of them, he's simply assumed them. So the real test of perspicuity isn't unanimous agreement among all who claim to use Scripture. It's whether Scripture successfully communicates saving truth to those who are properly employing ordinary means. And here, the evidence is overwhelming. Core Christian doctrine has spread across every culture and century with consistency among those who accept Scripture's authority. So here's the bottom line, why Joe's unanswerable argument has been answered. Now, Joe's argument appears powerful because it appeals to a simple intuition we kind of all have. Disagreement undermines clarity claims. But when we subject this to rigorous philosophical analysis, especially looking at the literature on the epistemology of disagreement, his argument collapses. Protestant theology has principled resources to explain both Scripture's clarity and persistent disagreement. Take the noetic effects of sin, how sin sort of distorts our cognitive abilities, and the distinction between likelihood and conditional peers, the difference between surface and deep disagreements, the role of spiritual illumination and understanding, which we didn't even talk about. Joe hasn't shown that these explanations fail. He's simply assumed them away by treating all disagreement as epistemically equivalent, an assumption that the philosophical literature rejects. So the irony is pretty delicious, actually. Joe's unanswerable argument against Protestant perspicuity ends up showing that Protestant theologies actually has some philosophical sophistication. While Joe operates with these folk intuitions about disagreement, Protestant theology aligns with cutting-edge epistemology. Scripture's clarity remains intact, and the disagreement that Joe points to reveals not textual obscurity, but the depths of human fallibility. And that's exactly what Protestant theology has always maintained, and that's the real answer to Joe's challenge. Not that disagreement doesn't exist, but that its existence means something very different than what he assumes. And when we properly understand it through philosophical analysis rather than sort of surface level intuitions, disagreement confirms rather than undermines the Protestant position. The unanswerable argument has been answered. The question now is whether Joe will engage with the actual philosophical issues or continue conflating distinct concepts while demanding asymmetric standards. I suspect we all know which path he'll choose.